Hey guys, today we're talking real quick about the reform movements of the 1800s. Your objective question is, what were the major reform movements of the 1800s? And here they are. I'm giving them to you all at once. The major reform movements of the 1800s that we need to be aware of was the treatment of the mentally ill, the temperance movement, the abolition of slavery, women's rights, and education. Now, we've already talked about or touched on the abolition of slavery. We talked about a few major leaders at that point, and so I threw that in here. That is not a slide on here, but remember that is a reform effort and leads to eventually to, the Civil War. But these other four are new to you, so let's look at them. The first one, the treatment of the mentally ill. Dorothea Dix is going to be, she's a school teacher. Well, she's a teacher who works in a prison in, I believe it's Boston. And she realizes how terrible the conditions are, and she's kind of horrified. So she wants to see if all the prisons and stuff are this bad. And what she starts to realize is that in these prisons, and she goes to a bunch of different ones, mentally ill individuals are kept alongside criminals, and this is not great. This is not a good look. Remember that times have changed from way back then, right? And our views on mentally ill people have changed drastically, and that was spurred, of course, by Dix. So she went and she visited over 800 prisons and jails, and that word poorhouse is kind of like homeless shelters, but not really. And she saw how horrible it was that these, people who were, mentally ill, challenged in some kind of way, were just thrown into prison. And sometimes children who were disabled were thrown into prison with criminals, like with rapists and murderers and stuff. And she said, this is not right. We need to do something about this. We need to, as a country, come together and treat these individuals how they deserve to be treated. She's going to write a series of essays and writings and stuff and submit that to the state of Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is eventually going to pass a law that says, yes, okay, we need to treat people with, mental disabilities as not criminals, right? But as, patients, people who need to be helped. And just a few years later, 11 states are going to open up hospitals for the mentally ill. Now, were these perfect? Absolutely not. There was some sketchiness going on there as well. But this is a human... Next one, the temperance movement. So what's going on here is there's a lot of alcohol abuse in our country. Many people at this point in time in history are being paid. So some of their wages are actually supplemented with alcohol, right? So instead of 100% of your paycheck, you'd get 80% in cash and 20% in liquor, and people liked that. Back then, instead of taking coffee breaks, you would literally take rum breaks. It was a thing. It was not seen as abusive to sit there and drink all day. Public intoxication was not even, really batted an eye at. However, things start to change when domestic violence grows rapidly. A lot of wives and children are being abused by their dads and husbands because of this drunkenness. So the temperance movement temperance is a weird word, because temperance means, to temper means to kind of scale back. All right. So the interesting thing about the temperance movement is, depending on who you are, you had different views on how to solve this. So the temperance movement, some advocates said, hey, maybe we should just drink less, right? Others said we should not drink liquor at all. A lot of temperance advocates believed that liquor was literally the cause of everything that was bad in the world, right? Child abuse, being poor, right? Poverty, all those things were to blame, or liquor, was to blame for that. So anyway, very long story short, a bunch of states started passing prohibition laws, which is the making it illegal to buy, sell, or consume or transport liquor. A lot of states were going to get on board. However, it's not going to get nationwide recognition until later. The 18th Amendment is going to prohibit the buying, selling, manufacturing of liquor. But for now, some states are on board. North Carolina was one of those. North Carolina went dry long before the 18th Amendment told them they had to. So anyway, second major movement, temperance movement, cutting back on alcohol. Next, women's rights. As I mentioned, a lot of individuals who were kind of advocating for abolition and the end of slavery were also individuals who were advocating for women's rights. And this makes sense. They were speaking out against slavery. They wanted to make a change, but they started to realize that politically they have no clout. No one's going to listen to them. They're women. At this point in history, women aren't even legally allowed to speak in public to large crowds. Like, that's literally how limited they are. So the women get together, they call a convention, and the Seneca Falls Convention occurs, and I don't have the date for you, but it was early 1800s. Anyway, they get together and draft up the Seneca Falls Declaration, and basically what it says is that men and women are equal. There's a couple elements to this. One of them included women's suffrage, or the right to vote. Eventually they will get this. It takes quite a while. That amendment, the 19th Amendment, is passed in 1920. That is 100 years ago. This year will be the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. So 1920s, right, is a little bit farther down the timeline than we're looking at. We're looking at kind of the start. And of course, those leaders, if I go back, everyone's heard of Susan B. Anthony, right? But some early important leaders, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that's her right there. This is Susan B. Anthony, This is Lucretia Mott, and then Sojourner Truth, an African-American female advocate. Cool. And then lastly, education reform. This man right here, Horace Mann, if you've ever, cursed because you didn't want to go to school, you can thank this man, Horace. Horace decided that the great equalizer in our country should be education. He was horrified when he realized that the only children who are being educated in our country at this point are the wealthy ones. And that's because these schools, and we're talking about like pre-college, we're talking about like, elementary, high school kind of age. The only people who are going to those private, really fancy, expensive schools are the really, really wealthy white kids. Horace is disturbed by this. He's a Whig. He believes that, now that more and more people are voting, that the voters should be informed. That's a really important concept right there, the informed voter. And he's saying, listen, if we're giving all this power to the American people, they need to be knowledgeable. They need to know history and math, and they need to be able to make, decent choices for themselves. So he says, listen, as a country, we should all commit to just educating everybody, right? And they say, well, that sounds cool, but how are you going to do it? And he goes, well, these public schools are going to be supported by taxes. And the couple really wealthy people who pay taxes say, no thanks, I'm already paying for my kid to go to school. And all the poor people who would benefit from this say, thank you, but we can't pay taxes, right? And it goes back and forth. And eventually, public support wins out for public schools. And now public schools are supported by tax money because Horace Mann makes the case that, listen, it kind of sucks to pay taxes towards schools, but in the long run, it's better for our country because as a whole, our population will become smarter, more intelligent, more educated, more aware. Now, of course, this is still going to have limits on who exactly can go to these schools. Females are allowed to go to school, but their education track often looks a lot different than the males. Oftentimes females will spend time taking home ec classes and stuff, whereas the boys will go and learn science and stuff like that. Also, African Americans are going to be extremely limited in what they're allowed to do in the public education sector. It won't be until after the Civil War that worthwhile kind of pushes for African American education will take place. And of course, there's absolutely no time at this point for any kind of children with disabilities or anything like that. So it's still very limited, but it is a good, step in the right direction. And lastly, the way we really got America on board for this whole public school thing was when the immigrants started to show up. We talked a couple of days ago about the huge waves of immigrants that are coming in. So a lot of Irish individuals coming over. There's a lot of Italians. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that those people coming over are American immigrants, right? We want them to be as most like us as possible. We want America to look like America. And the best way to convert all these immigrants coming over, America decides, is to, teach them about America. So throw a couple civics courses in there. Talk to them about national pride. Teach them the national anthem. Teach them the Pledge of Allegiance, right? And gradually, the plan is, right, to basically indoctrinate these immigrants, to teach them how to be American, and to teach them how to act like Americans, right? So, of course, with U.S. history, there's always that thread there. trying to kind of assimilate everybody coming over. Alrighty, so those are the 5 major reform movements. We've got education, treatment of the mentally ill, women's suffrage, oh goodness, I just forgot the other one, temperance, and of course abolition. All right, make sure to answer your objective question, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.